I don't think it's only me who randomly came across the concept of existentialism in my late teenage years, or to sit in a warm, cozy cafe while tightly holding a volume of Camus or Nietzsche between my trembling fingers, thinking that reading these books will make me an intellectually superior being. Ah yes, we have all went through that intense angst, confusion and edginess, isn't it? Well, why not revisit our old friend today and look back upon the time when we questioned the meaning of our life. Existentialism isn't made up of one idea, but rather several different notions. Mostly, it is associated with European philosophers from the 19th and the 20th century. Although the name was coined later on by Gabriel Marcel in 1940s and later on adopted by Jean-Paul Sartre in 1945. But it is considered that this philosophy originated from Kierkegaard, who adopted this term from a Norwegian poet. Yeah, I'm not gonna even start on how to pronounce that name. Existentialism was originally defined as an ethical theory that puts human freedom at the core of human existence as intrinsically valuable, where it explores the problem of human existence through the experience of an individual. Although to make it clear, existentialism does not reject the validity of science, but states that the humans cannot fully understand themselves existentially even when science is provided. Now being done with the definition, let's move on to the main concepts. Heidegger was one of the first philosophers to bring attention to the idea of tension between the human and the external existence. This was done through his book Being and Time, which was published in 1927. After investigating the concept of existence, he came to reject that science could ever help humans to understand themselves. Thus he introduced the concept of authenticity, which would assist man to identify and define himself through freedom, choice and commitment. Heidegger went about into further investigation through using Husserlian phenomenology, which let an individual's consciousness assess the world directly. This was used by Husserl to clarify our experiences of nature, logic and mathematics. Heidegger was taking none of it because Husserl had failed to raise an important question about the individual's meaning of existence. Heidegger saw meaning of being as an essential question and stated that it cannot be simply solved through acknowledging the existence of the inquirer. In the end, taking inspiration from Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, he hesitantly became the father of existentialism. Kierkegaard was a mad lad who developed the problem of existence through his radical approach to Christianity. He called this the single individual, which focused on the singularity known as the me. This singularity comes out at the moment of conflict between the ethical and religious faith. In Kierkegaard's book Fear and Trembling, he argues that, for philosophy, my life becomes meaningful when I raise myself to the universal by bringing my immediate natural desires and inclinations under the moral law, which represents my telos, or what I ought to be. In doing so, I lose my individuality, since the law holds for all, but my actions become meaningful in the sense of them understandable, governed by a norm. For example, if I believe in the orders of God, then my life would be meaningful to the extent of conforming to the universal ethics. But what if I went against the moral values of my time? What if I poured the milk first and poured the cereal second? Then in this case, if my life is meaningful, then is my single belief higher than the universal values itself? That is where the issue arises. Because if my own values are meaningful, yet not governed by the universal values, then what standard are these values governed under? To solve this issue, Kierkegaard finds an individual's subjective view as a norm. He states, subjectivity is the truth. This was the foreshadowing of the concept of authenticity. I have no reason to pour the milk first, but I still do it out of a leap of faith. I don't escape the absurdness of my actions through conforming to the conventions, but instead turn the singularity into something universal for myself, which helps me become what I truly am. This is what Kierkegaard sees as an objective uncertainty created through the process of highest inwardness. On the other hand, Kierkegaard stated that the crowd is untruth. As the crowd follows the accepted values of the time, the values followed out of the fear of non-conformity. Kierkegaard sees this as a diversion from who an individual truly is. The objective truth of science and history can be well established, but these values still belong to the crowd. As for Kierkegaard, it is the question of being, not knowing. Thus, a truth does not take value when objectively established, but rather accepted through the sheer passion, even when it is highly uncertain. As we've already seen Kierkegaard's approach to the problem of existence, while Nietzsche does it following the phrase, God is dead, he responded to the European culture where the theistic moral values were depreciating and capitalistic thoughts were rising. Before Nietzsche, Dostoevsky portrayed such a God-ridden world through the character of Ivan Karamazov. In the book The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan states that if there is no God, then everything is permitted. So following this issue, Nietzsche tried to find a way to measure the human life in the modern world. He pointed out that moral values were created by the powerful to control the weak. The example of this was the Judeo-Christian moral order given in the genealogy of morals. Nietzsche came to the same idea that the crowd is untruth. Thus an individual following the universal values of morality is just a herd animal. But this herd animal can eventually take a turn for better or worse. For example, the shift of the values in the 19th century Europe began to attach importance to science rather than religion. In such a situation, if the individual is weak-willed, then he will come to see life as meaningless and fall victim to the nihilistic despair. However, if the person is strong, then he can take responsibility for his meaning. He will be able to teach meaning of the earth without requiring a need for external values to live on. Thus we can see that for Nietzsche, the problem of existence refers to the differentiation between the submission to the moral law and living beyond good and evil. While in the gay science, Nietzsche points out a standard appropriate to singularity of existence through creation of art. For example, if I give a comment on the style of this painting, I'm judging it according to a standard. But according to Nietzsche, this painting cannot be judged through a general law as the standard itself is a part of the painting. Similarly, existence has its own style. Ultimately, an individual creates his own meaning and value in the world. As we have seen, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche were the first to bring a light to the problem of existence, but their approach was not completely systematic, due to which the 20th century philosophers took on such a task. Of course, we had to pull Jean-Paul Sartre's slogan out of the bag, as it is one of the most well-known existential concepts brought forward. In simple, this slogan denotes that there is no objective definition of what it means to be a human, but this meaning can only be decided after human exists. As Sartre in Existentialism is Humanism stated that, what is meant here by saying that existence precedes essence? It means, first of all, man exists, turns up, appears on the scene, and only afterwards defines himself. If man as an existentialist conceives him is definable, it is because at first he is nothing. Only afterward will he be something, and he himself will have made what he will be. The core idea of existentialism is radically different from the traditional philosophy, where essence precedes existence. The nature is already defined and then existence reveals this nature. For example, human being is a rational animal, although most of the time that is not true. Ancient philosophy gave humans a place in the cosmos through provision of ideas that can assist in human development, while modern philosophy retained such an idea even when man was placed within the unknown universe. René Descartes rejected the past essential definitions by proclaiming that I think, therefore I am. Sadly, he was close yet far away from the single individual, as he looped back to state that the man's essence was thinking. But Heidegger disagreed with Descartes. Heidegger counter-proposed that the essence of human was to exist, and to only exist. Although there are instances when human tends to have essences, as Heidegger said, that there are certain structures which we shall exhibit, not just any accidental structures, but essential ones which in every kind of being that factical design may possess, persist as determinative for the character of its being. These instances of human essence are thus explained by Heidegger's modes of being. These modes include ready to hand and present at hand. Take for example a hammer. It is ready to hand. We use it to hammer things in without thinking what its purpose is. We only focus on the task rather than the object. But when it comes to present at hand, then it is the complete opposite. If the hammerhead comes loose and you can't use it anymore, then you come to focus on the hammer and ask what the heck is the issue. This observation is the present at hand. This case can also be applied to a human. Although social values are not enough to justify the purpose of a human, only I can decide who I am through analyzing my properties, as this action is impossible for other available entities. Heidegger expresses that existence is care. To exist is not simply to be, but to be an issue for oneself. A human differentiates itself from an object, an event, or a process, as humans can make an internal distinction in existence. Existential philosophers use concepts of facticity and transcendence to show why this is the case. In easier words, facticity is the third-person interpretation, which includes all objective properties I have. For example, my 10-inch gun is a factual characteristic of mine. But all these characteristics describes us but does not give us essence, as even a donkey has a 10-incher. While transcendence is my interpretation in first-person perspective. The factual information does not restrict my ability to do whatever I want. Thus, existence is determined by facticity and transcendence, which makes me not a Cartesian ego, but a being in the world. The interpretation of a human being rational is not my interpretation, but it is the world that makes us look rational. Jean-Paul Sartre's existential psychoanalysis uses the above two concepts to help an individual understand his pattern of behavior through reconstructing the meaningful world. In the end, assisting the individual to create meaning and well-being. The anti-Cartesian view covers the theme of estrangement of an individual with its surrounding and itself. This alienation is felt upon the realization that this world around me is not brought into existence because of myself. Heidegger's thought of the uncanny world points out how a person does not feel at home. This is a major contrast to the ancient philosophy of the cosmos, where human beings are well ordered. Secondly, I'm not the only one who reveals the world, but I'm also part of other people's project. Sartre brings this alienation to the light in his famous analysis of the look. When I am engaged in the world and just focused on myself, then I only have the first-person perspective of my existence. Unless I become aware of other individuals who view my existence as a mere part of the world, I cannot view myself from the third-person perspective. It is because other people exist in the world that I can take a third-person perspective on myself. This shows how alienated I am from my own existence, as my objective characteristics can only be revealed by another person. Finally, the project for meaning I reveal belongs to the world. I find meaning to the already existing culture and society. Thus my very engagement with the world estranges me from the world. This again is brought up by Heidegger's anti-Cartesian self, where the individual self is not defined by the person itself, but what it engages with. This leads the individual to become indistinguishable from all the other entities, as everyone tends to carry out the same activities. Wittgenstein shows that rules and norms are public. Thus, when I carry out these actions, then I become interchangeable with anyone who carries out these similar activities. I make memes on Reddit, but anyone who does the same can replace me. If I decide to become radically different from the norm, then I might not be recognized. Thus, I am anonymous, someone who is replaceable. Anybody can take my place, but I can only change this creation of alienation to the singularity of my existence. This is where the idea of authenticity kicks in. So the question is, how can I find this standard where I can put enough effort to be myself? If a good hammer is defined by its essence of hammering the nails, then how can a human do the same without having an essence? Well, the idea of authenticity is used for answering this question. Authenticity is that one has to create oneself and live in accordance with this self. If I act morally for the sake of the duty and rules, then existentially this is not possible. While if I create this moral character and then choose to be moral, this is my choice. Not because the society wants me to be moral, but because I have committed to this project of mine. Thus only in the latter part, I succeeded in being myself. This way I can finally recover from losing myself in the crowd. To become myself, then an anonymous oneself. This project can be taken a step forward through the form of a story of a unique individual. One can become author of their own story, instead of their story being dictated by the world. Authenticity is the standard we were looking for, a standard to judge whether I have succeeded to be myself or just failed, and taken the roles assigned to me. Ultimately, this is where existentialism finds the singularity of existence. Although there is no set way of life, but only the way how I commit to my project. Thus this makes ethics an interesting topic for existentialists. It is through freedom that existentialism approaches the questions of ethics, so let's have a look at it. The ethics of existentialism do not depend on the conventional standards. The values are rather derived from the very idea of existence. When one follows their meaningful projects, they tend to create values on the way in the meaningless world. Thus we view the themes of anxiety, nothingness, and the absurd in this context. The concept of freedom is neither established against the system of determinism, nor along the lines of Kantian self-consciousness, but is established through the mood of anxiety. Already a great start, isn't it? Heidegger and Sartre develop on this mood of angst as something that reveals the self. When I fear, I feel threatened by something. It could be the fact that I fear the dark, fear the neighbor's kid, or even fear disappointing my parents. But when I'm anxious, I am not threatened by anything. Anxiety cuts my connection with the world, therefore taking away the projects and roles that I saw as something meaningful. All this leads to the collapse of my characteristics because they were tied with these things that I considered meaningful. The only thing left behind is the realization that I'm just like anyone, replaceable and common. Heidegger describes this as an existential solipsism, where I am the outsider who observes the people living their lives normally, following the roles they thought as their own. The anxiety turns the experience into the absurd. This connects to the theme of alienation we discussed earlier. As long as I am absorbed in the worldly matters, I don't feel the meaninglessness of the world, as all things appear to have reason for being. I feel at home for the time being. But as I delve into the mood of anxiety, I begin to disengage with the world. The meaning of all things that surrounded me just seemed like mere names. The human is trapped within the absurd, where he tries to find the meaning, but can't in the cold and vast universe. This absurd is the central theme in Camus' The Stranger and Sartre's Nausea, where the main characters find themselves in an alienated experience. Such an experience is no more genuine than my practical experience of the world. It is no less genuine either. Thus an existentialist account of meaning should acknowledge both possibilities. Another term for the meaninglessness of the world is the nothingness. As defined by Heidegger, this is an understanding of the world under the influence of anxiety. I am brought to the thought of death, where I possibly cease to exist. This anxiety can motivate myself to authenticity, where I choose to create the self, consequently making myself responsible for the role I created for myself. This is what Heidegger calls the mode of self-awareness, the mode where I create the self of freedom. While Sartre argues that anxiety provides a comprehensible experience of that freedom, for him, freedom is disturbance of consciousness from its object. Consciousness is nothingness. There are no objects in consciousness, but only objects for consciousness. In this manner, consciousness is radically free, as it cannot contain or be acted upon by other objects. The consciousness that we come across is actually our ego. It is what encounters experience, while consciousness is free to pick out of the experience we experience through our ego. This consciousness of ours is totally free to choose and cannot choose to not choose, as it is not an option. I am so free that I can never be not free, because freedom is essential for existence. He said that we are condemned to be free. Thus the anguish of freedom. By running away from this anguish of freedom, we commit bad fate. For existentialism, freedom lies within the transcendence and choice, while Karl Otto Appel tried to bring existentialism and scientism together, where justifiable concepts can be brought to light by value-free objectivism of science, while all other concepts become matter of existential subjectivism of religious faith and ethical decisions, while positivism based its theory over the cognitive meaningfulness of the concepts. Factual concepts that were proven through scientific investigation were considered cognitively meaningful. In contrast, questions of value were treated as cognitively meaningless, as they were based on subjective and emotional response. This was opposed by existential thought, as values were viewed as groundless. For Sartre, values derive their meaning from an original projection of myself, which stands as my choice of myself in the world. Sartre claims that values are those experiences that do not just affect something, but make a claim on a person. For example, I do not just see the beautiful fireworks of the summer festival, but my eyes register the brightly lit sky while actively distinguishing the different colors and patterns. I don't just drink a cup of warm tea, but my taste buds discern the flavor of Earl Grey. The experience demands for me to respond, so I choose the response according to what I want. In this way, I find my value in my response. As Sartre states that value derives its being from its exigency, and not its exigency from its being. Why do I choose to drink Earl Grey when I can drink any other kind of tea? Well, I choose to do so because the fragrance and taste makes me feel like a royalty. After the choice, I engage myself into the process of drinking this tea. But what if I disengage from this tea drinking experience and question, why do I want to feel like a royalty? Then the more I question, the more I am threatened by the ethical anguish. The existential response to such an anguish will be the value and meaning I create by committing and engaging with my choice. Sartre again states, I am the one who finally makes values exist in order to determine my actions by their demands. Ultimately, commitment and engagement are what leads to an authentically meaningful life instead of relying on an abstract value system or divine will. Although I make my choice alone, but upon the time of implementation, I am never alone. I'm always historically and politically situated. This is why we see most existentialist philosophers linking commitment and choice with political struggles and historical reality. By making a choice, I engage to create meaning in my own world. Although, as previously stated, I do not carry this out alone. I am around the continuous flow of time where history and politics exist. People follow the predetermined roles and follow the norms. They don't question about the herd mentality and tend to carry what every other person does. If I question and then choose to go against this norm, then who I am to be is thus inseparable from the question of who we are to be. I cannot just ignore the existence of political, social, and historical aspects that surround me. Such a way of thinking was not only influenced by the collapse of European history and politics in 20th century, but is linked to very existence itself. Sartre and Heidegger examined how authenticity related to history and politics. Heidegger sees existence as history. He considers that the worldly structure of a human is based on the series of events that took place. This existential temporality is not a sequence of time, but a unified chunk of time. My future is where my potential projects take inspiration from the past, where my completed projects lie. This is all done for the creation of meaning in the present. My existence is not discrete, but I carry the history from my birth to death in a continuous form. This results to my authentic self, which needs to create the meaning in terms of the history. So when I make a choice, it is not just part of the present, but belongs to the potential wholeness of my existence. The choice is always affected by the political sphere, as I live in a society. Upon experiencing alienation, I try to recover my authentic self through two ways. First way is to choose from the possibility of design that has always been there. What this means is that what I choose as my identity comes from the philosophies or traditions of the past. I need to understand myself in terms of these historical entities. I might choose and commit to the life of Diogenes, or even choose to understand and commit to the values of filthy Frank. This historical dimension, which Heidegger calls fate, doesn't control my choice, but holds a certain authority over me. The second way is to accept the norms that belong to itself. The nature of normality makes it impossible for me to accept norms that only holds for me. Heidegger sees social elements to restrict the genuine fate or choice for me, as an individual has to act with the community that he or she lives in. Thus not everything is possible for an individual. When one makes a choice, it needs to respond to the history, which makes a claim on him. This was how Heidegger also chose his hero, Plato's philosopher king. Moving on to Sartre, he had a different outlook of how history and politics gave birth to the social through the concept of the look. When someone else sees me as a part of his project, then I am differentiated from something that I can make myself be. For example, I can be constituted as a man in a woman's resentment. I can also be constituted as a good YouTuber in my viewers' appreciation. In this way, I have no control over my description of who I am. The only thing I could do is to distance myself until I get back to my subjective position. In the end, there will always be conflict and instability over describing what we are. This conflict is further explored by Sartre through the lens of historical materialism, as social relations do not take place between humans, but also between institutions that portray a relation of power and domination. Simone de Beauvoir represents such a situation in her book Second Sex, where females are already defined as women. This is the third-person look of the patriarchal institutions, consequently making it harder for females to define their meaning and projects. In Existentialism is Humanism, Sartre argues that freedom itself was what had authority over a human. When human engages with itself, it engages with freedom. While in his book What is Literature, a human is always struggling against the concrete unfreedoms, such as capitalistic exploitation or racism. We could see here that Sartre is pinning the idea of freedom as self-making. Such commitment led him to combine existentialism with Marxism to create the one philosophy of over time which we cannot go beyond. Yeah, actually he literally said that. Sartre saw history as a situation where people's self-making project took place. Following that, existentialism was a diagnosis of the past and a projection of the norms appropriate to the future. This was how the present time took importance. Later on, Sartre was discontent from the philosophy of self-making, as he also wanted to highlight the historical and political situations instead of just individual choice. This led him to find greater hidden value in Marx's dialectical approach to social and historical reality, as Marx had defined the unignorable restrictions that came before humans due to the nature of economic scarcity. Thus, according to Sartre, true freedom wasn't possible until the problem of production and life was solved. Sartre saw growing issues with Marxism of his time, so he wrote The Critique of Dialectical Reason in order to restore the promise of Marxism. This was done through the existential doctrine of self-making, where not only a man was created through history, but the man was also the one who created the history. The concept that overthrows capitalism was not a consequence of the economic forces, but the choice of several individuals. The absolute freedom thus only comes to who choose the dialectical materialism. In this manner, authentic existence has a historical and political aspect to it. Although the authentic self also does not depend on a particular perspective of history or theory, the view Sartre and Heidegger took over history and politics should not be seen as a scientific account, but as their commitment to politics, a view of theirs that they wanted others to see. The philosophy of existentialism reached its peak during 1930s to mid-20th century. It was a new way of thinking that helped people understand the human through authenticity and meaning. Today, the Society of Phenomenology and existential philosophy devoted to Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Jaspers, Simone de Beauvoir, and other existential philosophers carry on the tradition of existentialism. The existential thought is still alive within the recent movements of structuralism, deconstruction, hermeneutics, and feminism. In modern times, people who draw sources from existentialism include Judith Butler for gender studies, Lewis Gordon in race theory, and Matthew Radcliffe and Gavin Aho for psychopathology. Although as a philosophy, existentialism is shunned by the academia, mainly due to its continental nature, as most of the academic circles tends to focus on analytic philosophy. But this does not take away the popularity of existentialism outside the academia. People in today's world are more than ever alienated, isolated, thinking that their own systems have failed them. While science do provide humans with medicine, space stations, iPhones, and never-ending list of innovations, but it still cannot fulfill one of the most important human needs, the need to create meaning in the middle of the ever-expanding universe. That is what existentialism gives us. Now go to your local bookstore, grab a book of Nietzsche, Sartre or Camus, and then find a cozy little cafe to sit down and begin the journey of existence and meaning.